We'll just wait for a few minutes for everybody to join our webinar for today. Perfect. We'll start now. Hi, everyone. I'm Koshki from the Cobus team in London, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world today for this webinar. Here at Cobus, we are delighted to be providing this weekly webinars to support the British international school sector. As a member association, we also provide other services for our schools, such as CPD courses, global student competitions, safeguarding, and safer recruitment support, as well as many other initiatives. If you're interested in finding out more about Cobus member benefits, I will put a link in the chat with more information. We are pleased to welcome Chris Scorer, the International Schools Manager at Century Tech, who will be leading this session. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be emailed to everyone who registered, so don't worry if you can only listen for part of the session. It will also be made available afterwards on our website. Please do use the chat function to get involved and submit any questions you have, which will be answered at the end. You can also start by just telling us where in the world you're joining us from. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be online talking to you all. Particularly love working with Cobus schools. We've been working with Cobus schools for a long time, but most recently we've been involved in a huge competition with Cobus schools around the world at Century Tech, and I imagine that some of the people that are online today have been involved in that. So thank you. My job today is to talk about democratizing data, and some of you may wonder what exactly I mean by that and why is it important. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but I do forewarn you that actually coming into it today, I'm probably going to pose more questions than answers for you in terms of moving forward, because clearly I don't know the context that you find yourselves in, and the people that you work with and so on. And really, that's what it comes down to. So the first thing is probably worth getting across the fact that I have a teaching background. I've been an academic head. I've been a pastoral head. So I've sat in your shoes as well, and I've faced some of the challenges. I have a rather privileged position now as a schools manager, in that I work from a shed at the bottom of my garden in Newcastle, and I don't have to deal with that kind of windy, turbulent environment that comes with actually being in a school, working with children day in, day out. So some of what I say is a sort of utopian ideal, I guess, today, but let's get to that as we move through. I'm a big proponent of school data. I think it's hugely important. And today, hopefully, we're going to talk about how you might be able to unlock some of that and whether schools are actually using it effectively. So I guess the first question for me that I'm going to pose to you, and we have got a bit of participation to go on, is how important is school data in the context that you find yourself? We collect mountains of the stuff. It's ubiquitous. Mark books, online trackers, standardized assessment, all of that kind of stuff. We collect mountains of it. But equally, I imagine most people on this call will have seen the roll of the eyes from some quarters in their staff room when they've talked about those very things. You might have even heard that reference that I know my students better than any standardized test does. Or you might just have had staff that are a little bit scared. There's a colleague that I knew, I won't mention her by name. She was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. But when you mentioned data or a spreadsheet, you could see her blood ran cold. She was terrified of it. So I guess I've got a question for you now about how important school data is in the context that you find yourself. And I'd like to have some honesty in the responses if possible. It is anonymous. You won't be named and shamed, so you can speak the truth without fear of recrimination. And you should see a QR code on your screen. If you scan that, it takes you to a survey. Or you can join at slido.com with that number at the bottom with the hashtag. And hopefully, once you've done that, we'll start to see some of these results feed through in real time. So if you could click on that QR code or onto the website address. Okay, crikey. Let's see some of these results coming through. Not sure much of the data could be useful if we had some training. Um, yeah, okay, pretty good. Oh, most of the data we collect is useful for teachers and pupils. Like it, nice. Yeah, okay, numbers starting to drop. This is quite interesting. Um, yeah, the idea of training. Oh, some people think it's really super. Use all of the data collected has a direct impact on teaching and learning. That's great. I'm glad to see that the one about SLT and inspectors has got a zero response at this point. Okay. I think if we'd done this survey maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the results would have been marginally different. And it's really interesting to see that we're moving in the right direction. I think we've probably got data savvy teachers coming through the system, and we've got data savvy SLT. But there's a recognition in those results there that it's not perfect and that we probably could do with a little bit of training and support to use it properly. Implicit in that is that it's possibly not being used to its full extent. And I think that's probably fair. Most of the data we collect is useful for teachers and pupils, 60% of respondents. Um, that's fantastic. I wonder if that would have been true if we'd surveyed the whole staff across your school. Would they entirely agree? It may be, it may not. I don't know. I'm going to move on from that. So if you've got any votes to put in, pop them in now, and then we'll move on to yeah, a few more. Not sure. Catching up. Pretty good. Dropping back a little there. Um, Well, fascinating. We're all in a good place with data, but there's a recognition that it's not perfect. Probably just under half probably recognize the need for some training and some ideas around how to utilize data and make sure that it's used in the day to day. Okay, fabulous. Thank you for doing that, folks. As I say, you won't be named and shamed. This is a quote, and this is a single example, but this is maybe telling you how important um, data is within schools. This is in relation to a standardized diagnostic test. And it's from a chap called Brian Coughlin, who many of you may know. And it was when he was at North Anglia International School, Hong Kong. He's moved on since then, I believe. So at a previous school, two girls in the bottom set surprised us all when they achieved phenomenally well in the diagnostic maths assessment. They'd been bored rigid and had been deliberately failing exams. So it shone a light. Um, it provided that diagnostic. It let you have a look at what was going on. And it's hugely, hugely important. It's a you get to see what's actually happening in your school. And that can be when it contradicts your perception, it gives you a few surprises, or it can actually be that it's affirming your judgment, which again, data affirms judgments, it generates surprises, it supports reflection, but it also gives you the confidence to take those judgments forward and maybe move on from what would be a hunch that you might be a little reluctant to act upon into something a little bit more substantial, some action, a conversation with a parent, etc., etc. Not just that, school data allows you to have an insight into the prism that the children view the world through. We all have our prejudices, we all have our views, and we all have what we believe to be true. But if we can try and get around that and see how the students in our care see the world and how they approach the world, then we're better placed to manage that as teachers. Um, Understand the child, and you can do so much more for the child, I suppose, is the real thing there. And quite often, the other thing that I'm going to raise at this point, we talk about data predominantly in relation to academic progress, because that's the thing that we measure. We've got mark books historically, etc., etc. But arguably, if we can start to read the data with a slightly more nuanced approach and understand what's going on, that feeds into a whole set of attitudinal things. Uh, attitudes towards teachers, attitudes towards learning, attitudes towards self, confidence, that ability to move forward, self-determination, all of those important things. And if we're able to understand what's going on with a particular student, then we can actually start to build our approach to them. If we get the data right, the students will have a better experience. And I think that's really what I'm driving at here. Um, this is a quote from it was actually cited in a book by Duflo and Banerjee. I'm an economist, an economics teacher by trade. And it was cited in a book called Good Economics for Hard Times. Um, Banerjee won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2019, something about leaving global poverty. Pretty noble cause in my book. And it was a longitudinal study done by Fryer where they looked at data and how it was used in schools. And this fascinated me. There's no greater indicator of life chances than well-structured baseline tests and educational interventions. No greater indicator of life chances. This study followed the children into adulthood and it looked how their lives played out. And I thought that was fascinating, but it was also a pretty humbling concept that as teachers out there, the work you do is phenomenal. And managing your schools and managing your teachers towards what they do is perhaps even more phenomenal. The idea here is that what you do has an impact on that child's life forever. It's a trajectory. You set the trajectory that they take when they leave your school. The reality is this only works if teachers are on board with it, though. And the whole point of the title, Democratising Data, is all about making sure that your school data gets right down to classroom level, informs that classroom practice, and makes sure that it's actually being used in the day-to-day. For those of you that choose not to read economics books in their holiday time, which would be fair enough, this sentiment is also echoed in popular culture. I think it was quoted in Gladiator about what we do today echoes in eternity. So it's not just in highbrow economics literature, it can be found in many different places. But important stuff nevertheless. If we get it right, we can really have an impact on children's lives. Okay, so I like this analogy, particularly as a father with young children who stood on many bits of Lego in the last few years and caused himself grievous pain in the process. So if we have a look at this, what we can see is that where data collection is where you amass all this information and then you go through those various processes and arguably until you get to that point at level 5 where you're telling the story, you've got to ask kind of what it's all for. If it's internal stuff for the school, what's it actually doing? Is it actually reaching that storytelling and that classroom level? Is it impacting the lives of the youngsters in your care? 58% of people at the beginning suggested that most of what you collected was actually impacting students directly, which I liked. But maybe have a little bit of a reflection on that as we go through and think about whether you would stand by that figure at the end. How do we go about that process of going from data collection through to storytelling? Well, that's one of the things that we're going to consider as we go through. First thing is to consider some of the barriers to effective use of data. I'd be delighted if some of you might pop some of your ideas into the chat and see what those barriers are and perhaps how you actually overcame them in your context. That number 5, people previously have suggested it's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization, that it's rare and never really attainable. And I would argue exactly the opposite, that actually that's exactly where schools should be. I've seen it in practice, and I think that there are different ways that we can actually get to that. But we certainly need to move past that data collection and data preparation. And I think historically, we've possibly been stuck in levels 1, 2, and 3, and maybe not made it much past 3 into 5 at a sort of classroom level. We maybe have done in school management, etc., but maybe not elsewhere. So where would your school be? Just a little bit of a thought. You don't need to put it in the chat if you don't want to, but have a little bit of a think about that as we move through the the presentation. So the problem with school data, this is where I risk making myself very unpopular amongst data leads that have joined the chat. And the visual on there, the locked up treasure cabinet, probably speaks volumes about how some schools historically have approached data, but perhaps with a reasonable explanation to underpin it. GDPR and data regulation pre that, the Data Protection Act as was, meant the data needed to be kept securely. And that's fair enough. I have no question of that at all. But what that often meant was that it focused on SLT use, the select number of users. It wasn't released more widely. Quite often, data would be used in an accountability model rather than as a constructive support mechanism for teachers. I myself have sat in numerous end of year results reviews, talking to the head. How's it gone this year? Why is such and such done really badly? Why is such and such done really well? Those kind of questions. And very much part of that accountability model. And I imagine that SLT have had similar conversations with boards where they've looked at academic progress in their school and they've had to sit down and discuss that. I would argue that that should be the second tier of use for school data, that actually school data could be used much more effectively at classroom level first, but we need to separate it from that accountability model if we're going to get that real engagement from teachers and parents and perhaps pupils too. The other thing that often happens is mistakes, and mistakes do get made with data. And GDPR particularly raised the stakes on those errors and those data breaches and so on. So how people handle and mitigate for errors of data handling, how they provide for that, and how schools manage that is a tricky area. But you can rest assured that if you take a harsh line with staff that do make honest and genuine mistakes, then they'll back away from that kind of engagement with real data. And that's an area that you need to be aware of. And perhaps there are systems out there that can help support you from that data being handled badly by your teachers, even if it's in good faith. I think very often security does become the barrier to use, and we need to be careful with that we don't lock something up so much that we end up not actually using it. It's like the idea that you never use your best china. If you're never using it, what's the point, I suppose? Going on from that, I think there's a volume versus value discussion to be had in most schools. How much data are you collecting and how much data are you actually using? And that in turn feeds into the concept of data fatigue. And all of these issues have been cited by teachers as reasons why they're a little reticent about engaging with their school data and using it on a day-to-day basis for their teaching. And I think that's really tragic because you wouldn't want your doctor, your pilot, your financial advisor to not be data informed about your situation. So why on earth would you want your teacher not to be? And I think that we need to look at overcoming some of those problems. And I suspect that in some schools we've maybe been guilty of, we get on and we deal with the problems in front of us, and that's kind of just how it is. And I think sometimes we need to stop and reflect and move forward with that. Okay, so how do we get to that storytelling, that idea? Clearly, we want our teachers to be data informed with the work they're doing. We want it to inform how they approach their classes, how they approach their individuals, etc., etc. And I think that we've already mentioned that idea of separating the accountability model from some of the data collection that we have in schools? Can we use that data to support our teaching and moving beyond their own perceptions, rightly or wrongly, into something more substantial and more objective? So the first thing for me is to look at where my teachers are using data in schools and where they're not actually using data in schools. If then the teachers aren't using your data on a day-to-day basis for their planning, their teaching, their marking, their interactions with pupils, then I would go back to the sentiments echoed by Simon Sinek in the start with the why. I would probably go to the why not rather than the why in this particular case. Is it training? And we highlighted training at the beginning as an area where people might help support people engage with data. Is it fear? Um, is it a hyper accountability model? Is it just simply access? Is it workload? What are those barriers that are preventing your teachers from getting to that storytelling section? Now, I don't know your schools. I don't know where you operate. I don't know about how your teachers engage with SLT, etc., etc. But I do know the one common thing is that your teachers are your agents of delivery. They will make things happen or not happen in your school. So your teachers have to be equipped and ready to engage with the school data agenda, and it's got to be available for them to use in their day-to-day sessions. And if we don't do that, then it's going to be really problematic. But how do we move from that sort of situation towards a data-led school? It might be that you're already there. It might be that you need to change the culture, the philosophy, the practice, the CPD, even the recruitment. I would argue that recruitment is probably a decent starting point because you can bring people in that are data savvy and you can filter them out at the recruitment stage of things. But I think it's a really big question, and I certainly don't have the answers for you on that. But there are areas to consider and themes to think about as we go forward with that. Okay, this is a quote that I really liked, and I run the risk of telling a group of school leaders how they should engage in leadership, and that's not really what I'm about, and I don't want it to come across that way. What I really want is just to sort of perhaps remind people of how important it is to get that messaging right, and find that right context, etc. So this is the idea that the ability to integrate the talents of dispersed individuals in organizations is the defining competency for management and leadership. The dispersed individuals here, I would argue, first of all, are your teachers, second of all, are your parents, then your pupils, and then your SLT, etc., etc. But that's what leadership is. We need to bring those people together, get them on board with this data agenda, and make sure that data is working within the school, within the classrooms, at parents' evening, all of that kind of stuff. But you have a very different context. We've got schools from all over the world today. So you have a very different context from another school just down the road even. And I don't know what your context is. What works for John might not work for Louise. Certainly what worked for me in Italy didn't work in China. Well, that was a culture shift for me. And there were some hard lessons to learn in that first month in China for me. And I imagine that you've all experienced something similar, having gone from one school to another, one country to another, and so on. Okay. But it doesn't matter how you make it work. You've got to find a way to bring those people on board. There's got to be a discussion. There's got to be engagement. And there's got to be insight coming from all of those quarters if your data is really going to have that impact that we touched on with Fryer at the beginning. Some good starting points. I imagine some of you've met Steve Munby. I met him a few years ago. Nice chap. Liked what he had to say. Read his book. He signed my book. That made me feel very happy. Signed my book, and it's a good starting point. It's this idea of distributed leadership, and it comes from Alma Harris as well. where you actually empower people to make choices and decisions within your organization. And I think that if you do that and you don't punish too hard for the mistakes that might happen, you need to find some safe spaces to get data to the teachers and get them working with it so that they're not nervous, they're not scared. And similarly with parents as well. And I recognize that particularly in certain countries, that's quite hard engaging parents in a sophisticated dialogue around school data. People only do their best work when they feel safe. And I think that within schools, with school data, if we can move it away from the accountability model, maybe move it into a safe space. Perhaps we could create a safe space with a set of new student data and ask groups or cohorts to explore. That's a really nice way to do it. Encourage experimenting, allow people to sort of ask the silly questions because they need to. They need to develop their understanding of it. Encourage risk taking a little with it. Um, if any of your IB schools out there, you'll be familiar with the learner profile, the risk taker. We encourage children. We're possibly less good at encouraging staff to take risks, and it's a tricky one to do. But I would create that safe space dialogue. I would have that conversation. And I would cite an example from, I used to work at Pangbourne College in Berkshire. We used to wear Harry Potter robes. It was also a very traditional British public school. And we used to have a pastoral meeting on a Friday night of all things. And it used to run from around 6 until 8. Um, and all of the boarding house staff would go into that meeting and we would just chat about all of the information that we had about the pupils, things that were going on, and that sharing of data. It wasn't a spreadsheet, it wasn't a data dashboard, it wasn't a Power BI, but it was a sharing of information about pupils, and it left us all so much better informed about the kids in our care and how to approach them and how to make things work for them, and perhaps how to when to stop trying to intervene, when to step back as well. And we need to create that safe space. And if we can have those dialogues with our staff, it's fantastic. I would encourage you to read Steve's book. Um, and I promise you, I'm not paid a commission by Steve at all for saying that. The other one that I would point you to, I like John West Burnham's model, and this is huge, and I think it possibly where a lot of the sort of data agenda falls down in schools because it's so heavily regulated, and because the risks associated with a data breach or getting it wrong and ending up with a WeChat group going mad. Um, because we have that, we tend to focus and gravitate towards control in schools. And I think that John West Burnham talks about this move away from control if we're going to move towards mastery. And I've got to say that I am not without sin in this respect. When I used to run my tutor meetings as a housemaster, I would generally bring pizza for the tutors. Why? Because it's a little more difficult for people to offer up dissent when they're eating. There's less scope for dialogue. And working in a boarding school was busy. I was busy. I had loads of time. Command and control was easier than doing the right and proper thing of engaging and listening to people all the time. I just had a lot of stuff to get through. So I'm not without sin, and I would hate to suggest otherwise. But if we can move away from command and control when it comes to sort of modeling the leadership of data, then actually that's the only route that we've got to moving towards that mastery or expert of the people in our organization. And ultimately, that's what we want. We want everyone doing really good stuff. We don't want everyone doing what they're told. We want them doing really good stuff, doing the best for the pupils. To do that, you've got to move away from control. And one of the steps is that idea of collaboration. And I would point towards the idea of safe spaces for exploring data within your particular context. Choose maybe your standardized tests, your end of year exams, and put people in a safe space with people of a similar rank in the hierarchy where there is no power dynamic, and suggest that they just explore the data and find out what it means. Throw their ideas in the hat. Don't be afraid to offer ideas that might be a little bit out there, because they might be offering insights that have never been seen before. If we can move to that kind of collaboration side of things, we can then develop the confidence in the people that we're working with. They start to develop that confidence because their ideas gain traction with their contemporaries and their colleagues. And then from there, they become a bit more confident working by themselves, autonomously, looking into that data independently, drawing those conclusions from it. And then as you work through that and you develop those skills yourself, working independently, possibly referring to colleagues at different points in time, only then will the staff that are working with day-to-day data find their way to that idea of mastery or expert. It depends on which bit you read. It's referred to as both. But you can't get to that unless you're prepared to relinquish control, encourage that collaboration, and be willing to allow a little bit of autonomy. Granting that autonomy, opening the door to that, means there's going to be stuff that happens that you don't agree with absolutely everything. And that's a comfort thing that possibly you may be familiar with, or it may be something that you're not familiar with. But arguably, to reach that mastery point for your staff, you need to make that jump. I like there's a quote, and I can't place it, but I've read it years and years ago, and it's about teacher agency being the capacity of teachers to act purposefully and constructively to direct their own professional growth and to contribute to that of their colleagues. Well, arguably, that's exactly what this is. We can't do this unless we let go of that control at some point, with a framework, with support, and then the collaboration, and move people towards that mastery. And if we want that mastery in our schools, we've got to make a conscious choice to move towards it for everybody. So how do we get to that? Well, I've given you a few ideas. We've talked about it, but I think it is important that we try to move towards that data storytelling for every individual pupil in our care. Because if we go back to that Fryer study, then the life chances and the impact that this stuff has is huge. And we incumbent upon us as educators is to take that on and run with it and make it happen. And I don't suggest that it's an easy task. I'm going to give you some strands, some ideas that we can work with. I think that if we can use our data to affirm as much as make change, I think that's a really important thing, because when you use data and it affirms teacher judgment, that builds confidence and trust in that data. So whether that's a progress test at the end of the year, a diagnostic on something like Century, wherever it happens to fall, if you can use that to affirm those judgments and affirm those interventions, that's brilliant. Builds that trust. If we can use school data to reflect rather than prove, that's that idea of moving away from control, and moving towards reflection. And I think that we all have a little bit of confirmation bias in us, or even a lot perhaps. But if we can use it to reflect rather than to prove, then it's a much healthier environment, because it allows us to ask questions, not just of the children that we teach, but also of ourselves. There's got to be something reciprocal in it. Okay, that kind of engagement, passing between people, bouncing ideas off each other, I think that's important too. And I like this idea that it's motivated by inquiry rather than judgment. That's similar to that sort of reflect rather than prove. But that idea that we move away from accountability when we're working with school data, at least on one level, is really important. Frameworks. We can certainly use frameworks to support that. We can set that up. We can create those safe spaces with a particular brief. How does this impact well-being? How does this impact academic progress? How can we use this to develop our planning strategies, etc., etc.? We can use those so there is a degree of consistency in our school. We can use those safe spaces in a similar fashion. We can create that safe space with a particular brief. But we need to try and move our school data right down to classroom level, right down to the individual interaction between that teacher and the student. I'm a little bit of a romantic insofar as I believe that teaching still happens in that magic space between teacher and student. And I think we can use data to support that. Um, I might be a little bit naive. I might be a little bit idealistic. And I don't have to teach 25 kids 4 times a day anymore. So I recognize that too. Okay, so can AI help? Can it do any of the heavy lifting? I wish I had all of the answers here. Um, AI is amazing. It does some incredible things, and I'm getting used to using it. I work for an AI-based company, and we use it very well. Absolutely, AI can help with some of that data, some of the data analytics, but I'm not going to advise you absolutely on where that AI can go in the future and how that would do that. If you do want to find out a little bit more, we are doing a session at the Corbis Leadership Conference in May about AI, the moral imperative. I'll be talking about that then, and I'll have a little more substance there about how AI can actually help you and why you must engage with it going forward. Explore some of those platforms. Perhaps that's a good way to get some of your teachers to engage with it and see what those platforms can do with some of that data. But I've got to tell you, there are risks. A lot of the AI platforms and a lot of them stuff that's out there for schools is quite often just a wrapper for some of the bigger large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, etc. Um, and there are risks because there's an exchange of data going on. Quite what that exchange of data might be in your circumstances with the prompts, etc., that you give, I don't know. But that's a risk. AI is not massively well regulated at the moment. There's that sort of Wild West mindset that we have, perhaps that we had when the internet first arrived on the scene, as it were. So there are risks, and then there's the risks of the hallucinations and the quality of the feedback and the sort of echo chamber process that you might get with some AI that's out there. I'm not going to talk to you about all of the massive risks that are there today, but you need to be aware of that. And I would be nervous about encouraging my staff to engage with AI platforms with real life school data. I'm not sure that's necessarily something that's terribly safe just yet, unless you're using a closed system, something that's quality assured. I think one of my colleagues, I think my boss is actually on this call, so he'll be happy to have seen this slide pop up. Um, and Century is a closed system. It's our own proprietary AI. There's no exchange of data. Stuff doesn't go onto the wider internet and so on. So there are solutions out there. And I'm sure that if you wanted to talk to us a little bit more, we'd be more than happy to speak to you about that. So do take a look at Century as a possible solution for you. Bottom line is this. This is the data triangle. It's a model that I saw used in previous lives at different jobs. But I think that if we take account of the fact that we've got all of this stuff coming in, that if we use it properly, we can do pretty amazing things with it. We can help raise potential, help kids realize their potential. We can help stretch that. We can help push them a little bit further. Um, we can look at making sure those kids are happy in their time at school, that they get joy and they're in a positive mindset. Arguably, coming out of school as well-rounded individuals is perhaps more important than coming out of school with a rack of great grades. There may be people on this call that disagree with that, but I think if I was to recommend somewhere to start, I would start with some well-being data. It's very difficult for teachers not to engage with that because it's so important and most will see the universal benefit of it. Equally, it's something that you can work with parents around. And perhaps in some of those parts of the world where well-being means something slightly different, it's a useful starting point to have that discussion and move towards some common ground with your parental cohort as well. But I think if we're going to get to those happy kids engaging with our education, engaging with our lessons, and doing the very best for themselves as well, then we need to be mindful of that data and we need to get it down to day use by teachers. Because if we don't, then I guess ultimately, what's the point? That, broadly speaking, is what I've got to say. Um, I'm a little bit nervous about the questions now because that's the bit of the session you can't control. Um, but I'd love to see some of your questions. I'm not sure if Kushiki's able to feed some of those through to me now.
Thank you for the presenting the webinar. It was a lovely topic that you covered. We do have a few questions in the chat as well. The first one was, should we not be careful with AI analytics considering GDPR and storing data within their servers?
Yes, is the short answer. I would be very, very nervous about my teachers doing any kind of data analytics via an open system like ChatGPT, Gemini, or anything like that. I would certainly recommend that if you're gonna use something that has an AI function, that it's a closed proprietary system. I certainly know that Century is a closed proprietary system, and there is no exchange or publication or sharing of data, anonymized or otherwise, on there. But I would be terribly nervous about that. And that's one of those areas where you do expose your school to great risk if you haven't managed the training and support and clarity of purpose with your teachers very, very clearly.
Perfect. The next one was about the 5 steps that you talk about, from data collection to the part where you actually work with the data and schools can. The fifth step.
Yeah.
Somebody in the chat said that they get stuck at step 4. What would you say to that, and how can schools, overcome the hindrances that they might face?
Okay. I think actually this is the easiest one to answer in some respect, but the hardest one to deliver on. It's all about time, resource, and choice and priority. And, if you're going to move to that telling the story section, you need to go beyond processing and managing the data. You need to be able to have that time. One of the best things that a school can do is to create non-accountable time in their timetable, an extended tutor period, for example, and don't give the tutors anything particular to do. It's tempting as academic managers or leaders to want to fill all of the time that's available. But actually, some of the real magic happens in those conversations, in that soft time. And I think if you can create that, or have something at the start and the end of the day where there's a sort of milling around of teachers, parents, and kids, where everyone's available, you can create a nice space. That was something they did at my school in Italy. We were obliged to be in the playground where the kids came in the morning and last thing in the afternoon. And you know what? A lot of very serious business was dealt with at a very low key level by doing that. You can do something similar with tutor time, etc., etc., etc. But it's a resource choice. And ultimately, I recognize that that resource choice constitutes money. And that's a much harder thing because it's an intangible and you can't measure it. Yeah, that's what I would do to move on to that.
That's a lovely answer. Another question that came through just now is, how would you assess well-being?
Okay. Well, can you assess well-being? There's lots of tools out there on the market that will seek to measure well-being in some shape or another. But you'll know yourself, how you feel first thing in the morning can be quite different to how you feel last thing in the afternoon. Some schools buy platforms in for sort of regular check-ins, so youngsters can kind of check in, and so on. But actually, probably the most effective way to measure well-being or assess it is the very same answer I gave a few moments ago. It's that soft time. It's that unaccountable time. It's that space for those conversations. You know yourself, when your tutees come into your classroom in the morning, you'll be able to spot whether they're in a good place or a bad place. But if you've got a whole set of admin to run through, you don't have the scope for that conversation. If, however, you've got soft time, not only can you assess it effectively, but you can start to move towards making the right sort of steps and improvements to move that forward. Um, as a housemaster, I had an inordinate amount of time engaged with pupils in that soft time, and we created that as part of our prep session. Um, I don't know if David Griffiths is on the call, but he would be furious if he knew that I'd taken some of my prep time and used it as a kind of soft time that was unaccountable. But those conversations, that time, that downtime is hugely important. It's the same thing. That's the best way, that teacher interaction supported by data. The academic results are a really good indicator of whether a student is struggling emotionally as well. If you can track that, you can track that you can start asking the right questions.
Absolutely. In fact, it was really interesting how you talked about frameworks as well at one point. And can you talk a little bit more about how frameworks and stuff like that, the bubbles that we had on our screen, which talked about steps that schools can take? How is that
Sure,
useful for schools? And
sure. I think that the frameworks and I mean the frameworks will vary according from one school to the next. And I
yeah,
think it's probably best if you're putting something together to assess your data, that the framework suits your context. And that can be as simple as a set of questions to discuss amongst your teachers with a particular data set. Um, and they don't even need to feedback, put it into a record or anything like that. Just within those groups, they can talk about that. A little like the pastoral meeting that I used to have at Pangbourne College. Have that process ongoing and let them explore that data. What will happen? They'll go on a journey, and it depends a little bit where you are in terms of starting point. Some of your staff will be really data savvy, really switched on, very committed, and others will be terrified or totally reticent. And most of them will be in the middle somewhere. So I would argue that with that framework, you set your own framework up. And in the first instance, that needs to be quite soft and quite gentle, exploratory, taking that forward and letting people start to explore what the data actually means. Because as soon as you start to build in sort of feedback loops, it takes on a greater degree of formality. And you can only do that once people are confident and trust that the data is going to be used properly and that they're using it in their day to day. And arguably, you need to get staff using it in their day to day as the first port of call. That's the foundation, and then you can build upwards. And that's probably the wrong way around in terms of how most schools have approached things historically.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. That was a very insightful answer. Thank you so much for that. Um, And yeah, it was a lovely topic that we covered today. And just a last closing few statements about how you would say democratizing data is the way to go for schools.
Okay, well, I would take you back to that quote by Fryer. There's
Yeah,
no greater indicator of life chances. And I think that when you take that on board as a school, as a teacher, as a school leader,
yeah,
that burden is enormously heavy. Um, and as well as being a great honor, it's something that we've got to take really seriously. And data can help us put children on the right trajectory into adult life. And we're not only shaping what's happening today in our class, we're shaping what's happening in their lives if we use it properly. And I think the danger of it just being a compliance tool, just being a record for SLT, just being part of results review means that we never actually take that step. If you can get your data down to classroom level, you build the confidence of teachers to intervene early. That makes any intervention easier for the student, easier for the parent, and easier for the school as well. Okay. Their decisions are more informed. That makes them better. They make fewer mistakes. And you can move forward with that child on such a much better footing. And then from there, the SLT can pick up those bits and pieces and use them for their sort of higher order issues, if you like.
perfect, perfect. At the end, how would you say our participants and our attendees can get in touch with you if they would like to
Yeah.
talk about further?
Okay. Well, you've got my email at the bottom of the screen. I think the slideshow comes out with the follow-up email from Cobis. You've also got my LinkedIn QR code, which you can scan. It's on the screen now. Um, I've also got the academic references that will come in the follow-up. I don't expect you to scribble down the academic references today, but they're on a slide after this, so it'll come through. And I'd love for you to hook up with me on LinkedIn and keep in touch. I travel out to the various regions that I work with regularly, and I'm always looking for schools to visit, people to meet, and yeah, that would be great to meet you all.
Thank you so much. That was the last question. Big thank you to Chris for presenting. You can register for our future webinars on the COBIS website. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope to see many of you joining us later for our other COBIS webinars. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.